Welcome back to Getting Started with ASP.NET Core 3.0. This video is on configuration. How do you configure an ASP.NET Core 3.0 application? In this video, we will cover configuration of startup.cs, dependency injection, logging, and exception handling. To begin our discussion of configuring an ASP.NET Core 3.0 MVC application, let's look at program.cs. Line 15 has the start of all .NET applications, public static void main. Calls create web host builder, which you can see on line 20. Create web host builder calls create default builder on web host, and it calls use startup. Use startup calls a specific startup class. In this case, it's startup.cs. Startup.cs has two main features, a configure services method and a configure method. The configure services method, seen here on line 25, is optional. It is called before configure to set up the app's services. Set configuration options in here. Use this method to add services to the container. Common services are services.addMVC, which we will go into detail in section 2, services.addDBContext, which we will look at in section 3, services.addIdentity, which we will look at in section 5. Typically, you call the add service method, like addMVC, then you call the services.configureService method. Adding services here makes them available within the app, and in particular within the configure method, which we will discuss next. The next main feature of startup.cs is the configure method. This method is mandatory. Use this method to configure the request pipeline. That is, how does the app respond to requests? You can configure the pipeline by adding middleware components to the app. Middleware is software that creates a pipeline to handle requests and responses. It does work before and after calling the next component in the pipeline. It can short-circuit the pipeline by choosing to not call next. The order in which middleware is added is important. It determines the order that they are invoked. Examples of middleware components are using the developer exception page, as seen on line 43, which we will cover later in this clip, the error page exception handler, which we will cover later in this clip, static files, which we will cover in the next clip, and app.useMVC. The app is an instance of iApplication Builder interface and is created and passed in by the hosting container. These methods don't have to be in a startup class. They can be as simple as anonymous functions in the webhost.createDefaultBuilder method of the program. Let's create our own Hello World startup class called MyStartup. In our folder in the Hello World application, create a new file called MyStartup.cs. Then create a class. In this class, we will take just the mandatory configure method. iApplication Builder is a class off of Microsoft.ASP.NET Core.Builder, so we need to add a using statement here for that. In our configure method, we will call app.run. We will send run an anonymous delegate. We also need to use Microsoft.ASP.NET Core.HTTP. That's all there is to it. Now let's go into program.cs and change this from use startup startup to use startup my startup, and press F5 to run the application. Once it's built and started, you will see the words Hello World. That's because the first run delegate terminates the pipeline after it says Hello World. That's all there is to it, creating your own startup project. We just created our own startup class, and in that class we had our configure method that took an iApplication Builder called app. But where did iApplication Builder come from? It came from something called dependency injection. Dependency injection is part of inversion of control, or IOC. It takes the act of newing up a class and moves it to a central location. The other part of IOC is called service locator. This helps with testing. It keeps your code clean with a single responsibility principle, which states that every class should do one thing and do it well. That means that class A shouldn't depend on creating an instance of class B. It should just be passed an instance of class B. Common dependency injections in the startup class are iHosting environment to configure services by environment like development and production, iConfiguration to read the configuration files, and iLogger Factory to create loggers and configure services. Back in program.cs in our Hello World application, let's change this useStartup to use the original startup class instead of the new one that we just added. Let's add some logging middleware. A logging provider displays or stores logs. Console provider displays logs on the console. Azure App Insights stores them in the cloud. Azure App Insights will be covered in section 5. Let's add console provider to our program. In program CS, after useStartup, call configure logging. The default project template calls create default builder, which adds console, debug, and event source logging providers. To override the default providers, call clear providers in configure logging, and then add your own. Now let's add console logging. That's all there is to it. To create logs, get an iLogger tCategory name object from dependency injection and call log severity on it, such as log information. Open up controllers, open up homecontroller.cs. At the very top, let's create a constructor for our class. The parameters that it gets will be an iLogger of homecontroller, and we will call this logger. In order to get iLogger, we have to add a using statement for Microsoft.extensions.login. Then let's save logger off to a private field. Now let's use it. Scroll down to the privacy action where we created our JSON string. Rather than just returning the JSON string, let's log it to the console first. And that's all you have to do. Save it, press F5, and run the application. When the page comes up, click on the privacy link, and you'll see your JSON. Switch back to Visual Studio Code, and in the terminal, you should see an info helloworld.controllers.homecontrollers, and you will see our JSON that we outputted. Exception handling has three main parts: the developer exception page, custom exception handling page, and status code pages. The developer exception page shows detailed information about exceptions, and it is made available by the Microsoft.ASP.NET Core.Diagnostics package. Let's take a look at this. Open up startup.cs, and in the configure method, you'll find this if-else clause. If environment is development, then app use developer exception page. This is the developer handling page here. If you're not in development mode, then the app.useExceptionHandler is here. We'll take a look at that in just a moment. The app.useDeveloperException page should not be used in production. It should be the first line of the middleware that is added to the pipeline. Let's take a look at this developer exception handling page. Open up controllers and open up homecontroller.cs. In homecontroller.cs, look for the privacy action where we added the JSON. Right below logger, let's throw a new exception. We can ignore the green squiggly for now. Now let's press Ctrl F5. Ctrl F5 launches the application without debugging. And we'll see why in just a minute. Now that the page is loaded, click on the privacy link. And this is our developer exception handling page. An unhandled exception occurred while processing the request. Exception, I'm not happy. Line 35 throws new exception. That's our stack trace. We can also view any query string data if it was available, any cookies that were available, and all the headers. This should give the developer enough information to see how to fix the problem. Now, why did we press Ctrl F5? Ctrl F5 runs the application without debugging, as I stated earlier. If we run it with debugging, so press F5, the application starts up again, just like normal. But when you click on the Privacy tab, Visual Studio breaks on the exception and gives you the information that you need within Visual Studio Code to debug it. That's the developer exception page, but what about this other use exception handler? How can we view that? Well, as you can see, if environment is development, then use the developer exception page. All we need to do is change our environment. Scroll up to the .vs Code folder, open up launch.json, and here you'll see env ASP.NET Core environment equals development. Change this to production. Save the file, and then press Ctrl F5 to launch the application. Click on the privacy link, and a new error page will appear. This is the custom exception handling page. This should be used in production. It is a good idea to only have static content on this error page. But where did this error page come from? Let's take a look at that. Go back to Visual Studio Code, and in the Views folder, open up Shared. In the Shared folder is this error.cshtml. This is where the error comes from. Error occurred while processing your request. There's a third type of exception called status code pages. We can get to the status code page by going to a page that doesn't exist. You can see here that we get an error 404. This is a page from Microsoft Edge. How can we customize this page? To provide these, we need to use static code pages middleware. Let's go back to Visual Studio Code, stop debugging, and close this debug console so we have more room. Scroll down to our startup.cs, and before we say use MVC or use static files, we want to add use status code pages. So I'll add it right here. There, that's it. Now, if we run the app, and go to a page that doesn't exist, we get a status code 404 not found. But we still haven't customized this page. Let's look at how to do that. Switch back to Visual Studio Code and stop debugging. Close our debug console. And on this app.useStatusCode pages, let's add some code in here. The first parameter is the MIME type, which we will have as text plain. The second parameter is the body. That's the simplest thing we can do to customize this page. Let's go ahead and press F5 to start debugging. And once again, go to a page that doesn't exist. And you can see our status code page here. That's the easiest way to customize this page. In this video, we looked at the configuration of startup.cs, the dependency injection, logging, and exception handling. Please stay with us for the next video where we will look at serving static files. Welcome back to Getting Started with ASP.NET Core 3.0. This video is on configuration.